So I want to say that we are really lucky here to invite Director Heaton to the podium. As one of his earliest actions in office, Governor Rauner signed Executive Order 14 of 2015, establishing the Illinois State Commission on Criminal Justice and Sentencing Reform. And Mr. Heaton serves as chairman, and the commission has more than 24 criminal justice practitioners, lawmakers, and policymakers. As a matter of fact, this is a very timely conversation. The interim report is due tomorrow, and a final report by December. So I hope what we're getting here is a sneak preview of it. So please join me in welcoming Director Heaton to the podium.
Well, thank you, Julie, and thank you to the MacArthur Foundation for putting together this very interesting and very helpful presentation. I certainly took many notes and look forward to sharing the discussion with my colleagues on the Commission. I want to read you, and I know it's the kiss of death in any speech to read you something from a published work, but I just want to read you this sentence. The crowding of inmates in the Illinois prison system has reached crisis proportions, and the crisis is growing worse by the day. This was the conclusion that was reached more than 20 years ago by the Illinois Task Force on Crime and Corrections. At that time, which is the end of 1992, there were roughly 32,000 inmates in the Illinois prisons. Today, 23 years later, there are nearly 48,000. As Julie said, on February 11th, less than 30 days after being sworn in as governor, Bruce Rauner created a new commission on criminal justice and sentencing reform. He did this, I believe, for potentially groundbreaking purpose. He understands that we have overused incarceration in Illinois. He understands that if we study who we send to prison and for how long, and how we could better prepare them for successful reentry and alternatives to incarceration for some of them, we can safely reduce the prison population. And so he set that ambitious but achievable goal that Jeremy mentioned, that we would find ways to safely reduce the state's prison population by 25% by the year 2025. I am going to share just a few details about the Commission and how it's approaching its work. I'm not going to upstage the governor or the release of the report that will come out tomorrow, but I will tell you that the bulk of the work that the Commission needs to do remains and can be influenced, frankly, by you, by the people in this room and by other people in the state who need to get engaged, need to get involved, and need to help the Commission as it makes the decision about what recommendations to make to the governor. As Julie said, the Commission is made up of approximately 24 people, legislators who are experienced in criminal justice issues from each of the political caucuses in both the House and the Senate, former judges and representatives of the probation system, current and former corrections officials, law enforcement and prosecutors, defense attorneys, members of academia who specialize in criminal justice issues, victim rights organizations and community corrections organizations, and members, of course, of the governor's public safety agencies. They're from all parts of the state, from Chicago, East St. Louis, all the farthest reaches of the state. They have research expertise in sentencing and in our system's budget and programming capability. The Commission has divided itself into 5 subcommittees where much of the critical work will be done. And meetings of the Commission's schedule and those of the subcommittees are, of course, published on the Commission's website. We welcome your attendance and your input, particularly at those subcommittee meetings. We need to hear your voice. We need to know what you've already seen and experienced in communities throughout the state. The next meeting of the full Commission will be here in Chicago on July 23rd, and will be focused on issues particular to Cook County and Chicago, which is, of course, where approximately 40% of the admissions into the Department of Corrections come from. The Commission started its work by evaluating precisely how Illinois got to where it is. Commissioner John Mackey, who's here today, the Executive Director of the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, provided information about various criminal justice reform efforts in Illinois over the last 25 years. We want to avoid making any mistakes that prevented their earlier efforts from reaching their full potential. So what have we learned? Meaningful reductions are possible only if the reform efforts are sustained. We have a subcommittee that's focused on how we're going to implement any of the reforms that are recommended to the governor, because we believe that prior groups, prior task forces and commissions have come up with some perfectly good ideas that frankly weren't implemented very well, that weren't put in place and sustained over time. Meaningful reductions also have to not be undercut by shifting attitudes that deviate from evidence-based practices. We've got a number of programs, and I'll talk briefly about that later, in our corrections system right now. None of them are evidence-based. That doesn't mean that they don't have any value, but we can't prove that they do, and we need to gravitate our resources and our attention to evidence-based practices. And we need to make sure that we're focused on long-term, not short-term planning. We can't react to every sensational incident of violence, every sensational case with some new solution. We had a presentation from Dr. David Olson, a professor and graduate program director at Loyola's Criminal Justice and Criminology program, talking specifically about the main drivers of our prison population. Among the things that he revealed to us or shared with us is that over the past 4 decades, numerous factors have increased substantially to the lengthy stays in the prison system and to the number of increased admissions. 55% of the increase in the prison admissions in Illinois has been due to increased admissions for Class 4 felonies, our lowest level of felony. A large number of those, of course, are drug offenses. Most of those Class 4 felony admissions, most of them, have been people who were never previously convicted of a violent crime. Many had never even previously been sentenced to probation. Most of the sentences that have occurred since the early 1990s are substantially longer than they were before that. Truth in sentencing, a big part of it. Mandatory minimums, both of which were mentioned here today. A substantial proportion of the admissions are the result of mandatory supervised release being revoked, people being sent back, as was mentioned, for some sort of a technical violation, not necessarily for a new substantive offense. The Commission is focused and will focus deeply on that situation. What can we do with someone who doesn't follow those conditions of supervised release? What can we do to get their attention? Is it, as Mark suggested, I think, that we do some kind of swift and certain short-term incarceration, whether it's for a few days over a weekend, something that allows a person to remain employed and in the community? Mike Tardy, who's the current director of the Administrative Office of Illinois Courts, participates in the Commission and told us about the status of probation services, which of course are under the court system in our state. There are currently 138,000 people in Illinois who are on probation, most of those, of course, adult offenders, and he provided us with some very illuminating information about the resources that we have, frankly, withheld from the probation system. If we're not going to fully fund the probation system, we can't talk seriously about having intensive probation as an alternative to incarceration. We can't expect probation officers to be able to influence the behaviors, the cognitive behavioral decisions of offenders if they don't have the funding and resources necessary to do that. So one of the subcommittees that we have is specifically focused on budget and capacity issues. What do we need to do with the financial investment in the state on a sustained basis at all different stages of the system to make these solutions work? Jerry Butler, who's the Vice President of Community Corrections at Safer Foundation, presented to the Commission on the evolution of how we treat parole in this state. It hasn't been that long ago that parole officers were functioning primarily as counselors, as advisors to guide the development of someone who'd been returned to our communities after prison. That organization, the Parole Division in the Department of Corrections, has become more of a law enforcement organization. We need to address that as well and are looking at that. I mentioned that we've got to decide what kind of a system we want to have in place, and we've obviously concluded that it needs to be evidence-based. So we heard from Dr. Doug Marlowe. He's a member of the commission. He's also Chief of Science, Law, and Policy for the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. Dr. Marlowe is one of the country's foremost experts on the need for and implementation of evidence-based practices to improve a state's justice system, and he presented great detail about the need for a vigorous risk assessment model that's going to drive every one of our intervention decisions. The model is guided by principles of risk and need and responsivity. The report that we issue to the governor tomorrow will talk in more detail about Dr. Marlowe's presentation. I mentioned to you that the current programming, the current effort that we make within the Department of Corrections is not evidence-based. We've got all sorts of issues with what we do with folks in the department, and part of it is tied to what we have time to do. Roughly 1/3 of the inmates who are released each year were convicted of Class 4 felonies. The average length of stay, as has been mentioned here today, 7 months. This length of stay, the folks in the Department of Corrections will tell you, is not long enough for them, given the number of classrooms, the number of teachers, the number of programs they have available. In 7 months, they can't get someone through receiving and classification, assigned to a parent facility, through a waiting list, and into the class, and graduated from it by the time the person is released. We have only 15,000 job assignments available currently in our 25 Illinois adult prisons. Not enough jobs to even provide one to every inmate who's willing to work. There's a shortage of treatment slots for inmates in substance abuse programs, mental health programs. There's certainly a shortage of resources throughout the state for co-occurring. People have both mental health issues and substance abuse issues. That's going to be a dramatic resource need for the state. If we're going to take something like the redeploy program and try to scale it up and have it work in all of the counties across the state, we've got to ensure that all of the counties have the ability to put those offenders into, or former offenders into, programs that address their needs. Dr. Marlowe talked to us about identifying the sequence in which someone receives programming treatment. Can really matter. You can do harm, actually, to someone based on how you treat them. And you can certainly undo whatever good you might have done if you treat some needs before others. And the research reveals that to us. And so we're trying to dive into the substantive research about what those sequences will be so that our recommendations to the governor in the final report at the end of this year can lay out what exactly we need to do and what the investment would be. As I said, we need to look at these budget implications because we can talk, as Miriam said, we might know exactly what works, we can declare what we need to do, but if we don't put resources in places and make the investment first, if the programs and things aren't there, releasing somebody today will certainly cut the prison population number, but it's not going to deal with the real recidivism issue, and it's going to be a temporary fix. The Budget and Capacity Subcommittee that we've got is staffed by the Sentencing Policy Advisory Council and by the Civic Consulting Allowance. They've started the process of a deep dive into particular circuits or particular counties in the state. They started with Will County, which is a judicial circuit in itself, and really tried to understand how do we currently spend the money in the justice system in a county. What percent of it comes from county funding, what percent from state funding, what percent from local funding, and which of those sources of funding are used for which functions? You know, if the municipal government is paying primarily for the police force and the state is paying primarily for the prison system and some portion of mandatory supervised release, we need to know that so that if we're going to shift and steer the system in one direction or another, we got to understand who's going to be paying that. And if there isn't going to be enough money there, then we need to, as has been suggested, take money from other places where we're going to save it. If we're going to save money by reducing the prison system's size and divert that to the place that's going to need the money. It doesn't do any good to shift our prison population from the Department of Corrections to the county jails. If I'm going to take 25% of those 48,000 inmates in the Department of Corrections and just push them into a county jail, we haven't really done any good for the community. We're spending a lot of time and will continue to look deeply at alternatives to incarceration. We're going to talk to individuals from other states, so that we're aware of what's been tried, what appears to be working there. We're going to look at what our current funding is, as we said, for mental health and substance abuse treatments. We're going to look at what the waiting lists are, county by county. We need to know how many slots, how many beds are needed to address these things. And if we're going to take a certain sizable portion of the Department of Corrections and deal with them through other alternatives, we got to recognize that we're providing them mental health treatment now in the Department of Corrections. We can't assume that that disappears when they're now in the community. So we've got to make sure that the mental health capacity is enhanced in the communities where they're going to return. We are trying desperately to get the public engaged. We want the public included in this discussion, in our research and our analysis. We've, of course, invited the public and allowed public comment at all the commission meetings. All of our work is recorded and available at the commission's website. We're receiving some correspondence from individuals and from groups that care about this, but I invite everyone in this room to start to push for the organizations that you're a part of and the groups that you lead to get engaged and to provide us your ideas. Attend the subcommittee meetings. Those subcommittee meetings are operated very informally. You won't be sitting and watching the subcommittee meeting. You can participate in the discussions and have your voice heard directly on what you understand to be the best solutions. The Commission's going to submit its initial report to Governor Rauner tomorrow, and we will provide more detail than I had time to provide here this evening about what we've done in the first 90 to 120 days. But the Commission has substantial work left to do. We have to research, analyze, and debate the various options. We're going to continue to listen and actively seek the views of the people in communities like Chicago and East St. Louis, whose communities present particular challenges. We're going to listen and hear more from victims' rights groups and former offenders, government officials, treatment providers, and the courts. The Commission is going to study what other states and jurisdictions have done and make sure that it would be a fit for Illinois. Not everything that's been tried somewhere else can work here, but we need to know what they've done so we can consider it. The governor's groundbreaking goal requires not only hard work, but it does require courage from Illinoisans. One of the suggestions for me to take back was that we needed to have courage. It's going to require courage from Illinoisans to confront difficult issues and to question some long-held assumptions. The goal can only be achieved if we make smarter decisions about who should be sentenced to prison and for what period of time, who can and should be punished by other methods, and what steps can be taken to help other offenders return to successful citizenship after prison. I heard much good discussion here today about the things we need to do to enhance that successful return. Most people don't realize that the Illinois Constitution actually provides not only that our punishments would be appropriate and would fit the crime, but specifically provides that we would restore offenders to useful citizenship. This won't be easy, and truthfully, it won't be risk-free. But as Governor Rauner's order makes clear, acting boldly can make Illinois a better place for all of us. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Grace Ho, and I'm president of Woods Fund Chicago. Thanks for sticking with us through this really insightful conversation. I want to acknowledge and thank the MacArthur Foundation again for their leadership on this event, and thanks to the speakers for your candor, and to our other convening foundation partners, and finally to all of you in the audience. So I had the difficult job of wrapping this up quickly after a very rich and heavy conversation with some short words. So if there's one thing that I do today, I hope it's to encourage you to think of the issues presented today beyond today, to urge you to think and translate that thinking into action. What could your role be in ensuring that we are living, as Mr. Travis has said previously, that we are living at the tipping point and not at the new normal? Mr. Travis's words here today and the report has stayed with me since I first heard the presentation at John Howard Association's lunch last fall. And it was then that the idea of bringing the report to a wider audience was seeded. And here we are today, bringing it to you all To you, because we think that you will do something with the information. To you, because we believe that you will be moved by what you've heard, and you will help ensure that we move in the just direction. In the words of Justice Kennedy, we need to raise for all to see the hidden world of punishment in our country, and we should be startled by what we see. And I hope that we can all be startled to action. Mr. Travis has reminded us that we have chosen to be where we are today, at the pinnacle of the world in incarcerating our own communities, our own citizens. It was a choice. It was a policy choice. We have made a choice to live in a society that locks up African Americans at an amazing rate. And I also say that we have a choice to talk about racial equity, to talk about racial justice that undergirds the problem that we talk about today. So before I close, I want to tell you briefly about how Woods Fund has been startled to action. We are funding an initiative called Right on Justice, an effort led by Adler University and Communities United, including over 20 other organizations across the city that have come together around a restorative philosophy where harm is repaired. They have come together to transform schools, communities, and justice systems through relationship building and policies that effectively halt the school-to-prison pipeline and reduce mass incarceration of communities of color. At the end of the day, Right on Justice envisions systems that exact justice in ways that we would want it exacted on our loved ones. The justice you want for your children, for your family. And we welcome you to learn more about Right on Justice and plug in, of course. You know, we do regret that there was not time for questions from the audience, but we know and have asked all the speakers. They are available after the program for that purpose. So I thank you again, and I leave you with this final thought from the report, the fourth principle of social justice, whereby prisons should be instruments of justice, and as such, their collective effort should be to promote and not undermine society's aspirations for a fair distribution of rights, resources, and opportunities. I'm afraid that we've gotten too far away from that principle, but I also believe that we have the power to get it back. Thank you so much, and please join us for a reception in the rotunda.